Hello, everyone, and welcome to the House of Mr.E. Today, we have my good friend Dalton, aka the Authenticator, and we will be discussing the fantasy genre and what exactly comprises fantasy genre and some of our favorite works of fantasy. Would you mind introducing yourself to the people, Dalton?
Hello all, I'm Dalton Mortimer, I'm the Authenticator, and it's great to be here for like the first time in weeks, which is weird.
Hmm.
Blame the
So,
Japanese, they took Eglintine's streaming privileges away, apparently.
really,
Yeah, apparently there was something about how certain countries weren't able to view his channel, and then that led to him being uh unable to stream for a while, apparently. Or at least that's the short version of what I was led to believe, but who knows? YouTube
that's
shenanigans, basically.
that's unfortunate.
The
Let's get
capricious
right into our
whims of
topic.
Google gremlins.
Dalton, in your opinion, what comprises a work of fiction to be in the fantasy genre?
Okay, so that's a difficult question, but I'm glad we're at least starting from defining our terms. I would say um, something resembling a past focus or a focus on the past, whereas science fiction is primarily focused in the possibilities of the future and probably a magical element of some sort. In fact, in my opinion, you could almost rename fantasy as magical fiction. And in fact, part of me really wishes that were the case. So that way, the pairing of science fiction and what I would refer to as magical fiction would make slightly more sense than science fiction and fantasy, because that gives, for one thing, it gives science a little bit too much credit, and for another thing, it's just symmetrical, or it's not symmetrical, which I would like to fix and make symmetrical because symmetry is awesome.
Now, defining magic, do you mean the actual use of spellcraft, or do you mean beings of non-human origin that are said to be magical in nature?
The two are related. Typically, what I mean when I say magic is very much the occult definition, which is the extra-physical or paraphysical manipulation of life energy of some variety or other.
Now, you said that it should have focused on the past. Some works of fantasy fiction don't have any relation to the normal world at all. Some are set in completely alternate universes.
Right, which makes it slightly difficult, but um a lot of those still have it's less of a defined qualities make something in the fantasy genre and more just the coincidence of several different things which may or may not be optional.
I see. So let's get into one of the greatest works of fantasy fiction ever put to a piece of paper. J.R. Tolkien's, I'm sorry, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series.
Mm-hmm.
So this is set in a fictional world called Middle Earth. It features non-human races, elves, hobbits, dwarves, orcs, and it also features spellcasting and sorcerers like Saruman and Gandalf. Um,
Although technically the wizards in Tolkien's Legendarium are a species unto themselves, which admittedly is one of the tropes that I hate. But that he explains it in the context of they're basically quasi-angelic beings called the Maiar, I believe. If I'm mistaken about that, some Tolkien head in the comments can correct me.
yes, but what do you think of Tolkien and his work? His world is incredibly detailed. Some people might say too detailed in the books, but
I See, I would say that at least for my sensibilities, there's no such thing as too detailed. And in fact, I usually when I get into a franchise, I care more about the lore than I do about the character. My fascination with the lore often leads me to care more about the character than I would otherwise. So I'm fine with Tolkien detailing everything. And interestingly, Tolkien does something that I wish more authors would do, and he sort of pays credence to um older, more concrete sources because a lot of the things he does are founded in old Scandinavian and Nordic lore, Arthurian legend, um, certain certain pre-Christian or pre-monotheistic religions, etc. And it makes very much more easy to understand and I would say more substantive universe.
So you like the fact that a lot of Tolkien's lore and world building was taken from actual mythology in the real world
Yep.
and adapted to his story.
Yep.
So now the fantasy elements of Lord of the Rings. Is there any particular part of that that you enjoy? Any particular race or aspect of the world that sticks out to you?
Um, I always have liked the hobbits. Their lifestyle and their sort of typical mannerisms were always appealing to me. It's one of the reasons I like The Hobbit the best out of the four books in Tolkien's universe. Because The Hobbit is different from the Lord of the Rings stories, because Lord of the Rings is very much based in a similar tradition to the heroic Eddas and epic poetry in general, whereas The Hobbit is very much a adventurous fairy story of this homebodied, introverted, intellectual, comforts of home type being forced into a larger world that he knew existed but wanted nothing to do with. I've always found Bilbo to be a more relatable protagonist than Frodo in that same way. I would much rather, be left alone to pursue my various scholarly pursuits rather than get whisked away into an adventure. So Frodo's this pathological desire he had for adventure never struck with me, but Bilbo's I really would just like to go home and get comfy by the fire attitude was very much, yeah, I could see myself doing that.
Uh, Personally, I am a big fan of the elves. I really like the way they're presented. Uh, though the movies did a good job of giving the elves a very unique and elegant aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who enjoys historical styles of combat, the fighting styles of the elves are very interesting to me. So the elves are my favorite.
And interestingly, as someone who knows a lot about fairy lore, it's fascinating to me how accurate to the original lore all of Tolkien's races are to an extent. I mean, hobbits are obviously a made up race, but they take a lot from spirits like brownies and Devonies, which were household spirits, and the elves are very much more along the lines of the high elves as opposed to the sort of commercialized Santa Claus style elves that we are slightly more familiar with in a broader context.
Mm. So, what are your thoughts on the dwarven race in Lord of the Rings?
Again, a lot of it comes from old Celtic and Scandinavian lore, and I liked that because dwarves are traditionally mountain spirits and are associated with like uh fine metals and stuff. So the notion of their culture being based on mountain fortresses and metal workers makes perfect sense within not only the lore of Tolkien's Legendarium itself, but also and possibly causally because it also makes sense in the context of the broader lore.
Let's move on to the central object of Lord of the Rings, the One Ring itself. An enchanted jewelry that gives its wearer the power of invisibility, but also slowly corrupts them, as it also calls to its original master and forger, Sauron.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, as someone who knows more about the occult, Tolkien's use of an enchanted object as the MacGuffin?
Well, for one thing, rings of invisibility are not something that Tolkien originally came up with. For example, in philosophical thought experiments, there's this notion of the Ring of Gyges, which was a MacGuffin that gave you invisibility, and the original context in which it was brought up was if you were not accountable to anyone, you would become corrupt because you have absolute power, and that's sort of the same tradition from where we get the saying absolute power corrupts absolutely. As a in addition to that, the notion of placing a piece of your essence, your energy into an object, and that instilling that object with essentially a fragment of you or aspects of yourself is long held. But I think the closest analogy to the One Ring and its corrosive nature probably comes from the ring that is said to be wielded by King Solomon in several apocryphal books of the Old Testament. It was a ring that controlled demons, and the only reason why Solomon was immune to its effects was because he maintained celibacy and sobriety. But because, man is flawed, eventually he succumbs to that, and the demons retaliate by snapping his wits.
Mm.
So there's precedent towards all elements of the One Ring, and I think there might even be a Scandinavian piece of lore with a ring of invisibility as well, but I can't think of what that ring was called. It's interesting that he basically took elements of all three of those and just sort of hodgepodge them together into the One Ring.
Now, let's talk about another work of fantasy fiction that has gained a lot of popularity in the last couple of years. George R. Martin's A Song of Fire and Ice series, which was turned into the popular TV show known as Game of Thrones. And that show does include non-human races, but they are not as prominent in the story until we get to the big threat, which are the White Walkers, also referred to as the Others in the series of books. Now, the biggest fantasy element in Game of Thrones comes from the dragons from what were believed to be petrified eggs. Now, what are your thoughts on dragons in use of fantasy fiction and other mythological beasts?
I think there's a little bit too much of a tendency to use them as a plot device, and I don't necessarily know how much I like that. But as far as the Western style of dragon that we see in Game of Thrones, because there is a rather important distinction that must be made when you talk about dragons between the Western dragon tradition and the Eastern dragon tradition, because in the Eastern dragon tradition, dragons were thought to be noble, almost deific beings, whereas in Western tradition, or at least in the post-pagan Western tradition, they're more corruptive because, of course, they're reptilian, and that associated them with the devil and so on and so forth. But interestingly, in the pre-Christian sort of Celtic tradition, even the Western style of dragon did have more of that being of nobility or advisory position, more so than it does afterwards, after the conversion.
Now,
quiet.
I'm sorry, I was thinking for a moment. Now we get to the enemy of Game of Thrones, the chief adversary, the White Walkers, which are in fact, I don't want to spoil this for anybody who may not know this. So if you're unfamiliar with the origin of the White Walkers of Game of Thrones, I would advise you to watch or read that and then come back later. Now that I've given a fair warning, let's continue. The White Walkers are actually corrupted humans who were originally turned by beings called the Children of the Forest, who did this because they originally occupied the land before humans came to the continent. What are your thoughts on these beings being humans that have been turned into magical beings?
I dislike when races are given human origins in just about any fantasy context, but in this case I kind of let it slide because the children of the forest are fairly analogous, at least, to fairy folk, and this very much does strike me as the kind of thing a fairy would do if they were pissed off. So I don't know if George R.R. Martin intended for the children of the forest to be analogous to fairy folk, or if it was just kind of a thing that happened and he reinterpreted sort of something in his subconscious. But if he intended them to be fairy folk, then good on you. If not, then it's funny how things like that work out, even when the author doesn't realize it.
Now, in the books, it was heavily implied that people used to be able to do actual magic when dragons existed. And there's a place called the Citadel where their scholars known as maesters train, and they actually have magical knowledge, but they are unable to cast spells. And later simplified the book because dragons no longer existed. And now that they do, some people seem to be able to use magic again. A fine example being Melisandre and the various magical feats that she performs, including giving birth to a shadow monster. What are your thoughts on dragons being inherently tied to people being able to use magic in this world?
I don't necessarily know if I like it, but it's left open enough in Game of Thrones, at least for me, that it's possible that dragons might just be a canary in the coal mine kind of thing. Like magic ebbs and flows, and the existence of dragons is kind of the sign that there's enough magic here to be useful thing, as opposed to dragons being the cause of the magic. Because again, most, for lack of a better term, valid forms of magic are the manipulation of life energy in some sense. And it's possible in this case that the bulk of the overt magic in Game of Thrones might be drawn from the life energy of dragons, which is something that it's a thing with precedent in high magic, where you'll summon up an entity and draw on some of their energy to produce larger feats than you would be able to do by yourself. But I would rather just go on believing that dragons are sort of a canary in the coal mine of this is a sign that you'll be able to use it, as opposed to a source of it. Because that, for now, makes more sense. Unless we see an alternative version of magic in this universe at some point where there is magic drawn from the self, but dragon magic is stronger, which I'd be fine with. For now, I'm going with the canary in the coal mine theory.
Another form of magic seems to be necromantic magic used by the White Walkers, because any humans that they kill raise from the dead as whites in various forms of decay. And again, spoiler for anybody who hasn't seen the last season of Game of Thrones. Again, fair warning. the king of the White Walkers actually raised a dragon. Uh, one of the dragons died near him, and he retrieved it and used his necromantic magic to bring it back to life as essentially a Draco Lich. Um, what are your thoughts that these people who were not inherently magical in their origin, who were then changed into magical beings, now have access to such a powerful magic like necromancy?
Um, I always prefer systems where necromancy is more difficult because it is one of the most difficult and dangerous kinds of magic in just about every occult circle. Um, but I'm willing to give at least some leeway because, like I said, the children of the forest are analogous to fairies, so it's possible this might just be secondhand fairy magic. Um, and given how dark the Game of Thrones universe is overall, I'm totally I can buy that this is a thing that um fairies and fairy associated beings could do because there is this delineation in classical lore between the Ashili Fae and the Unashili Fae, which are basically, for lack of a better term, good and evil, but it's more analogous to dark and light. So if the children of the forest are straight up dark Fae and then they infect the White Walkers, then it's plausible that they can do necromancy, although I would prefer it be harder.
Well, it's implied that the children of the forest created the White Walkers purely as punishment for the humans invading their lands.
Yeah.
But let's change gears a bit. The past two series we've talked about have all been works of fantasy that have taken place in worlds that resemble absolutely nothing like the world we live in.
Well,
There are, however, other works of fantasy that take place in our world, or at least worlds that are similar to our world. Um,
analogous, yes. Although, in fairness, Game of Thrones does borrow a lot from what we know of medieval and feudal history, so it's plausible if a little bit of a stretch.
what do you think of fantasy series that take place in more modern times?
Um, I like them, but they are harder to pull off because there appears to be this tendency in most series that magic is a um nondescript, almost subjective deus ex machina as opposed to a form of study that has defined characteristics and properties to it. Which is why I really hate things like Harry Potter. Um, but when it's done right, like in the case of something like the magicians or the librarians, or basically anything based on comics or indeed comics themselves, um, it can be really really gratifying because you don't often see um, you don't often see practical uses of magic as a form of study outside of maybe the horror genre, which it's weird because there are often magical elements in the horror genre as well, but we don't consider them fantasy, which might it again kind of makes the fantasy genre a little bit hard to define, which is interesting.
Let's talk about the magicians. It's a favorite series of mine.
God, I love
The way I generally describe it as it's a mixture of Harry Potter with the Chronicles of Narnia, made to be much more adult, but also much more darker. Do you
I'm
think that's an accurate description?
I'm not certain to what extent I would give Potter credit there. The Magicians, if I remember correctly, came out r- relatively the same time, the books that the show is based on, as the original Harry Potters did, and I think Lev Grossman, the guy that created the books, just had more respect for magic in general, which I like, and I can't speak to that having read the books, but at least in the show, it seems like there's a lot more respect for magic as a concrete area of study that anyone can do, but it's difficult, so it's better if someone with a natural proclivity does it.
Yes, Lev Grossman is a much better author, in my opinion, than
J.K. Rowling?
J.K. Rowling. Yes, and
Yeah.
magic is in the books. Magic is a bit like chemistry.
Yeah.
There is a formula to the spells you cast. Casting it incorrectly could drastically change the effects.
Yep.
In one portion, they were running through the snow, and they had to use magic to protect themselves from the elements. And one character, Alice, actually intentionally misperformed a spell so that she could change its effects to keep her warm. I found that very interesting.
That it seems, and again, I haven't read the book, but it seems like the show is a fairly decent adaptation as well as fairly adequately accurate to proper magic. And that is another thing. From what you're describing, it seems like the accuracy to proper occultism isn't just a one-off in the show. It seems like the series also paid a lot of, or the book series paid a lot of attention to how magic functions, even if they change. This is another interesting element with me. I would rather people pay closer attention to how magic is supposed to function than the iconography that it's associated with. Because, like in Supernatural, they are very, very loyal to the iconography, but they change the functional elements a lot. Um, and I would rather a series like The Magicians or The Librarians that pays more attention to the functional aspect as opposed to the iconography.
Now, one thing the magician deals with is the traveling between worlds. The world they most frequently travel to, of course, being Fillory.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of fantasy fiction where somebody comes from the normal, mundane human world and is transferred to a fantastical world?
It's interesting because it has a lot of precedent in folklore. Like I've always assumed that places like Oz and Wonderland in their respective works were somewhat analogous to a place like Fae or Fairy in ancient folklore. There is this notion that the worlds, while separate, do overlap in either certain places or at certain times or just at the whim of a more powerful being. Therefore, you could be spirited away into a place like Narnia or Wonderland or Oz as and when either a particular being called for it or a particular circumstance was met.
Now, in the magicians, their magic comes from something called
The well.
the Wellspring, which was created by the elder gods.
Yep.
And it is possible for them to shut off the Wellspring, thereby robbing the world. And I believe it was shown the multiverse um, of magic. So,
Although humans only, from what I remember, because creatures that had magic innately woven into them were still fine to an
creatures
extent.
who were inherently magical in nature still had uh, their abilities. In fact, one of the characters, Penny, is what's known as a traveler, in that he can teleport and astral project between locations and even worlds. It was revealed that travelers are also inherently magical in nature. He could still transport himself, but he was unable to cast spells like a regular magician.
Mm-hmm. Although, in fairness, um, at least in the show, we see his hands getting massively screwed up. So, it is possible that he might have still been able to cast if he were actually able to cast using his hands still. But for reasons of the show's contrivance of plots, he wasn't able to cast at the time. So it's possible travelers may still be able to cast otherwise as well, but we don't know. At least not in the series. I don't know if it explained differently in the book.
The fairies in the magicians were still able to use magic. However, the way they used magic was very different from what humans know. It was more of a feeling and a manifestation of thought than the actual hand signs and the recitation of words of power.
Yeah, in the universe of the magicians with the wellspring, what you have there is basically something that we in the actual occult sort of circles would refer to as chaos magic. Chaos magic is distinct from other kinds of magic because it draws on random ambient currents of energy throughout the universe, whereas magic more traditionally draws directly from the life energy of something, whether it be the energy of the person who's casting, the energy of the person's surroundings, or the energy of a higher being. Whereas the magicians, it seems like the vast majority of all magic in the magicians universe is chaos magic derived principally from the current drawn from the wellspring. Which is kind of interesting because part of me wants it to be revealed that a certain like subset of magicians know how to draw on their own life energy and thus would be fine regardless of whatever the gods chose to do with it, with the wellspring magic. That would be funny to me.
In the magicians, it was shown that spells come from your emotions. The main character, Quentin Coldwater, was able to cast a spell, and the result being much more powerful when he was dealing with the emotions of finding out that his dad had terminal cancer.
Grief and pain, and yeah.
Yeah.
The main issue is always what source you're drawing from with magic, whether it's sort of mechanically from your energy or if there is some other medium like belief or an emotion. That's one of my least favorite tropes in fantasy fiction is there's this notion of, well, if you just believe hard enough, and it's like, no, belief is not what's important. It's the energy you associate with a belief. In philosophies like Hermeticism, which is one that I'm sort of closely fond of and closely tied to, there is a principle that states energy flows where attention goes. So you could potentially draw enough magic to power a spell from conceivably any emotion, be it extreme pain, extreme joy. But there is also a notion that different emotions have a different sort of structure to them, a different energetic sequence, sequence to them, or a different frequency. I hate using electronic words with magic, but if you like a different frequency, then different frequency works. So different kinds of energy are useful for different things. Like a certain energy might be more useful for a positive spell or a negative spell. Like grief is traditionally more useful for inflicting negative consequences because grief is already a negative kind of energy and there's less work in converting it over. Whereas healing, you're going to want to rely on something more positive because it's easier to work a positive end through positive energy. Basically. I apologize. I kind of rambled there.
No, you're fine. See. Damn it. I had a thought.
I'm sorry. My magic's burned.
Let me see if I can trace my way back to it. While Mr. E tries to recover his own memory, let's talk a bit about the library. The library is an organization that collects knowledge, including knowledge of events that is currently happening. There is a book for every human being alive, and in that book is their entire life history.
Yeah, a book for a book for every story ever written or never written, a book for every story that could possibly happen, including all the ones that revolve around people that currently exist and ones that have existed in the past.
All right, I remembered my thought now.
Okay, good.
In the Magicians, there was a spell that they could not cast because they were not powerful enough to cast it. Also, there was a weapon they could not use because none of them were master magicians at the time.
Yeah.
What do you think qualifies one to be a master magician in that world? Is it knowledge? Is it experience? Is it the amount of energy you're able to channel? How do you determine?
It seems to be some combination of all of the above, which is something that makes it somewhat, again, massive props to the magicians, which makes it more accurate. Because if you are familiar with the concepts like tempering of steel or stress testing materials, it's very much the same thing. If you start magic and you immediately jump to the most advanced grimoire work you can find, you are probably going to either A, not be able to establish enough connection to whatever plane you're establishing a connection to use it in the first place, and thus nothing will happen, or you will have just enough energy to establish the connection, but not enough to maintain or control it. And then you are basically screwed over. That is something that I really loved in the first season when they are trying desperately to contact a god. They have to sort of work their way up the spectrum of energy in order to basically make sure that their own energies were stable enough to withstand basically having the equivalent of an entire hard drive downloaded onto their brains, which in this analogy, I guess, would be a single flash drive. It's sort of like that. There's also a skill component though, because some work is very complex and intricate, and if you screw up something that's complex and intricate, it could very well be dangerous. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's both something equivalent to tempering, which is, making sure you're able to maintain and withstand energy, but also skill in the sense of if you don't have enough skill to do what's called web weaving, which is a process of sort of forming matrices of different energy, you shouldn't be trying complex spell work.
Now, in the series, in order to overcome this barrier, they intake the essence of the gods, which I'm not going to tell you which form that takes.
Oh my. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Let's just say Zeus and the other Greek gods would be quite pleased with this endorsement of their tendencies.
but the essence of the gods is shown to be raw power and enough to, even though they don't necessarily have the experience, they will have enough raw power to cast the necessary spell. What do you think of that?
I like that, and I also like that we see the kind of power surges still of what the show refers to as Niffins if they get it wrong. Because even if you somehow manage to borrow enough power to work something, if you're not skilled enough to be able to manipulate and control the power you're bestowed with, it sucks to be you because your mind or your body or both or your entire being might be compromised in a massive surge of energy. And that's never good.
Speaking of Niffins, one of the main characters, Alice, actually becomes one, and then she is in fact brought back when her Niffin is combined with what is called her shade, which is in that world the essence of her emotions, which I guess you could see it as her soul.
Her see the shade in the magicians I've always taken to be sort of the inner child more so than just the emotions. Because we can clearly see that Niffins do still have emotions. What they don't have is the sort of tethering to their humanity that their inner child might grant them. The sense of empathy, the sense of consequence, etc., etc. I apologize to anyone that can hear that. My brother's dog is barking incessantly again.
You're fine. I mean, I can hear it, but it's not a big deal.
Okay.
So, what do you think of taking the shade and taking the Niffin and combining the two together, bringing back to life the actual person?
The way they describe it in the show, in particularly the scene where Julia and Quentin, who are two of the main characters, are talking to one of their professors, which is the inimitable Mayakovsky, and talking about how the meta math never worked out before. That part resonated with me at least because there is a notion that um, different variables in a spell have sort of a meta mathematical component to them. That's why sigil work involves a lot of crunching of numbers. To create a sigil, you basically have to determine what the energy you're referring to would be if it were compressed into a mathematical sort of substructure, similar to kind of circuit board. And in that sense, it made a certain degree of sense, even though, as far as I am aware, Niffins as they are described in the show are a complete fabrication. It still makes a degree of sense that there would be what again Quentin refers to as metamath involved. Although
No.
I think that if the soul underwent the kind of destruction that Niffins go through in the show, those pieces wouldn't be whole enough to do that kind of calculation under most normal circumstances. You wouldn't be able to just, oh, you're missing a piece, let me go and get that piece and then put it back in you. There'd be a lot more involved in that.
In the magicians, a key piece of their spellcraft is hand gestures that are very specific and oftentimes very intricate. Um, in your experience, how important is that to actual spellcraft?
It depends on the culture and the system, but generally speaking, yes, it is kind of important because in most most diagrams of someone's metaphysical body, there are different layers to it, and one of those layers are the meridians, and the meridians are sort of circuits or channels of energy that go throughout the body that have sort of quasi elemental qualities to them. And in fact, you can see in certain diagrams, I think I used one in one of my videos where I mentioned this, there are elemental associations to each of the fingers. So if you're evoking a certain kind of elemental energy as part of your spell work, it would follow that you would do specific hand gestures or bend your fingers accordingly, especially if you're pulling off from a ambient current in the same way as the magicians do. Like I previously established, the wellspring is basically a form of chaos magic.
Bringing it back to the fairies, in the show and the books, fairies are instruments for making deals with other beings, and oftentimes the only person who can see fairies the persons that they made a deal with or who have made a deal with fairies in the past. How is the magician's portrayal of fairies um, accurate to what is commonly found in folklore?
Um, Here they sort of miss something of the mark in that I believe the term used in the show, at least, is they're spun from divine inspiration, as opposed to in proper Fey folklore, they're typically viewed as either lesser nature gods or nature spirits, basically the astral forms of plants, trees, and the ambient energy of the land itself. As to the deal making is a common practice with just about every kind of being, but yes, Fae in particular are known for being very um, strangely logic oriented and very detail focused. So bargains with a Fae are something that's known to happen, but as anyone who's read the original Grimm tales can tell you, Fey logic and human logic are dissimilar in the same way as conventional Victorian logic was to Wonderland, which is another reason why I kind of like the notion that Wonderland is a subcategory of Fey. Um, so you have to be very, very precise and particular in your dealings with them, or they're probably going to find a loophole. And I've never known in folklore or otherwise a Fae not to exploit a loophole.
Uh, let's move on to another popular work of fantasy fiction. This one is incredibly popular worldwide, Harry Potter. Now,
Uh,
in, in this work of fantasy, um, it very much takes place in the modern world, but there's also a hidden world that the wizards have lived in that is generally concealed by magic.
yeah.
And they also have mythological races such as elves, werewolves, giants, and a key part of the magic of Harry Potter is that they require wands to, at least, um, I believe it was shown that the Americans and British wizards require wands to focus their magic. I believe I heard that in places around the world, there are wizards in the Harry Potter world that do not require wands.
There are some that don't use them, but as far as from what I remember of all the books, and I've read all the books and I've seen all the movies, it's thought that humans, or at least human magic users, do need a wand to focus their magic, whereas certain creatures, in particular, I believe one of the examples is goblins and house elves, don't. And that's one of the reasons why wizards in the Harry Potter universe subjugate races like goblins and house elves, because there's a fear that if they were given the same kind of tools, their magic would be far more powerful and humans would essentially be subjugated as a result. I think in the Harry Potter universe, one of the greatest sort of magical inventions ever created was the invention of the wand by human wizards, because it gave them a level of refinement and utility to their magic that house elves and goblins and other races don't have or didn't discover on their own.
What is your opinion on people using things like wands as magical focus in order to cast spells?
Well, tools are definitely necessary in magic, in just about all kinds of magic. Yes, you can pull off things with your hands or with less concrete ritual tools like candles and salt and so forth. But the point of a wand or similar tool to that is to essentially focus and refine the energy, to step it up or make it more efficient in some way. That's the relative point of tools like wands. Interestingly, though, wands are kind of one-trick ponies. They're very, very specialized things in actuality, as opposed to in Harry Potter, you have a single wand that basically does everything for a given wizard. In it, from what we know of genuine magical scholarship, wands are very particular in their use. A single wand will have one use, and you'll have a experienced wizard will probably have, dozens of wands that do a single individual thing each. A staff is traditionally something that's more thought to be sort of a jack of all trades, which is why you see wizards with longer magical implements or staves a lot more often in traditional, especially Western traditional folklore, as opposed to wands, which are mostly a Victorian and modern invention.
Now, a particular thing about the wands in Harry Potter is that they have a item of magical origin as a core. Like Harry Potter's wand famously has a phoenix feather, and I believe one has a heartstring of a dragon. What do you think about them having cores that have magical properties?
As to cores, I've never really seen much of that in wand lore, but augmenting a wand, which is just a kind of wood or a specific material, with other materials to either make it more powerful or more useful, or to refine the energy even further than a standard wand would, is a common practice. So it's one of the few things in Harry Potter they get right. And oh my, if we were to get into the things they got wrong, boy.
They also feature flying brooms in Harry Potter. Now, of course, the flying broom is often associated with the stereotypical witches. But what are your thoughts on these things?
There are particular high magic enchantments that are reputed to grant the powers of flight and so on and so forth. But traditionally, the association with broomsticks is similar to the association with staves, except one is typically used, obviously, mostly by male high magicians, and brooms are more commonly used by female low magicians. The use of a broom, which has a particular special name in magical circle, but I'm blanking on the name, in genuine occultism, is typically as a anchoring point to a specific place when you ask to project. When you travel to different planes of existence, you use the broom as a guiding tool or an anchor to your proper reality. Also, brooms have a dual function of, traditionally, there is a notion that you can basically sweep aside evil, because much in the same way as a staff functions, the function of a broom is to pull the energy from higher planes and the energy of the earth or lower planes and merge them together. So basically, you pull energy into the broom or staff, and then you can use that to cast aside things that might threaten or vex you.
I'm back.
I'm not.
I had to take care of something for a moment, but let's see. Now, you mentioned when we talked about Lord of the Rings, people taking part of themselves and imbuing it into an object. So, on that, let's talk about Voldemort's Horcruxes
Yeah.
and the fact that he was able to live by imparting a piece of his soul into each of these seven objects.
Um, the Horcruxes are interesting because technically every enchantment is to an extent or other placing a piece of your energy into an object. That's how you enchant something. You create a matrix of energy, tie it to an object, and that object becomes imbued with that energy, and it into a in sort of a low level primitive kind of way, it sort of somewhat becomes alive. As to bifurcating your soul, basically, and placing the bits of soul into an object to guarantee immortality, that would be extremely difficult. I'm not saying it's unheard of because I have heard legends of it being similar things being done, but the soul is a complex thing in magical circles. It's thought to, in the same way that your physical body is made of like your nervous system, your endocrine system, your skeleton, your skin, and so forth. So too your spiritual body or the metaphysical aspects of your body have layers. And typically, when you are using magic, what you're using is built up excess energy. You draw in more energy than you would typically need, so that when you're casting, what you're essentially doing is working off of the excess. It's really considered fairly dangerous to go from scratch unless you're naturally inclined to have more energy, because you could very well injure your metaphysical aspect, which might lead to sickness, disease, death, madness, any number of other maladies. So you would have to be very skilled and um, very precise, and also very disciplined to pull off a straight bifurcation of your soul. And there would be so many layers that you would almost, even if you could manage the separation in the first place, the various layers would probably just decouple, and then you would be left with what was once your soul becoming ambient excess energy and just being sort of reabsorbed into nature, as opposed to ever being useful to you for the purposes of immortality. It'd be like if your soul is a piece of paper that's in the shape of a human, what a Horcrux would be is sort of making paper dolls out of that, and then taking the snippets of paper doll and putting those in whatever it was you were going to use as a Horcrux. But eventually, you would have less soul, and it would recuperate itself less. And that's the other thing. If you, under most circumstances, your soul would bounce back by absorbing energy from elsewhere. So I'm not sure why or how it was that he was only able to make seven, and also that none of them ever sort of reaffirmed themselves.
Well, one did gain consciousness. The diary in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets actually did gain consciousness and
I think they're
influence people.
all I think they're all low level conscious, in the same way that a repeating ghost is low level conscious. Um, I think
Well, the spirit in
rolling,
this one was actually able to have a conversation,
yeah,
an active
rolling
conversation with Harry.
rolling is never entirely clear on these things. I always took it as all the Horcruxes in the event that um Voldemort was killed or injured would be able to reaffirm themselves, and in that same way have a conversation with somebody or possess somebody. I thought that was part of the point, was I'm going to separate myself into various locations so that none, even if something happens to me, I'll still be able to carry on, because those parts of me will carry on and thus reassert themselves. I thought, but again, Rowling is very, very bad at actually providing distinct lore. She operates under the magic as Deus Ex Machina trope a lot. It's whatever we need it to be whenever we need it to be them, as opposed to this is what magic is and this is what magic is not. Therefore, there are specific things it can do and things it cannot do, which is which I would consider to be the more appropriate way of going about it. I really despise magic as a synonym for Deus Ex Machina in stories and narratives.
So, what are some works of fiction that you personally recommend?
Um, One of them is a book by Susanna Clarke, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, because to her credit, Susanna Clarke did a lot of research on actual magic while she was writing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I think I don't know because she's never mentioned, but I think a lot of what she did was she took something that had a real world equivalent and just created a fictional counterpart to it. Like in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, magic is very much a skill that anyone can learn, but that people have lost the capability to because a large part of the ambient magic that England once had was taken by a mythic figure called the Raven King. Um, and only a person by the name of Gilbert Norell was able to gather up enough knowledge about how magic worked and enough books of magic to cast properly. And a lot of his books have real world sort of analogs. Like one that he constantly references is a book um, called, I believe, The Classifications of Ernest Sutton Grove, which is basically an almost one-to-one analog for um, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's uh, three books of occult philosophy, wherein he basically goes on in meticulous detail catalogs all the kinds of magic that a magician must learn. And in the book, the Sutton Grove version is very much in that same way, and in fact, they mock it for being so meticulously laid out and not practical, which is one of the issues I have with Agrippa, for example. He goes so meticulous in this is what you should study as a magician, but he never actually goes through and tells you anything about magic in the process, or at least not much. So that's definitely one that I definitely would recommend if you're interested in magical fiction. Another is Lev Lev Grossman's The Magicians, because from what you've told me, it seems like both the book and the show focus on the functional elements of magic very well, even if it is chaos magic, which I personally don't like very much. Chaos magic is unpredictable and unstable in most cases, and so I try not to put too much credence in it. But I would much rather see something like chaos magic accurately portrayed than just magic is whatever we need it to be whenever we need it to be it, which
Mm.
is a lot of what lazy fantasy writers do. My contention has always been much in the same way as good science fiction basically takes a scientific concept or scientific principle and scales it up and makes it either easier or more useful. So good fantasy fiction, when portraying magic, should take an actual magical principle or magical concept and scale it up or make it easier or more overt. That would be my ideal for the future of the fantasy genre, is one in which um, you would do research on magical philosophy in the same way as a science fiction writer would often do with actual principles of science.
Let me ask you something. Uh, there's a favorite writer of mine called H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh God,
Um, I've heard some debate about whether or not his works were actually fiction or not. Do you consider them fiction?
um, there is a bit of a gray area there, I think. And in a lot of really good fantasy fiction, you will find a little bit of gray area in the same way as, to use my analogy from earlier with science fiction, a good scientist could take something from Star Trek and turn it into a cell phone. The communicator from Star Trek becomes the inspiration for the cell phone. So too, if a fantasy story is well written enough and its magical system is well written enough, there's no reason a skilled magician couldn't take bits from that story um and use it in an actual magical context. I think Lovecraft definitely deserves more credit in terms of um occupying that gray area. Um, as far as we know, the name Necronomicon, for example, is a fabrication. But also, one of the things we know is he took a lot of inspiration from ancient Sumerian and ancient Babylonian folklore. Um, so there are books that have been published under the title of Necronomicon that contain Babylonian and Sumerian magic, or Babylonian and Sumerian influenced systems of magic um, that do bear the name Necronomicon. So it's one of those. I'm not sure to what extent it's viable, but it could definitely inspire things that are viable. Viable. I can't speak. And also, particularly his dream cycle, actually, from what we have of his notes, is said to have come to him in a dream. So it's possible that some aspect of the higher realms of the astral plane that we typically dream in were reflected in his version of the Dreamlands, which incidentally also went on to inspire Neil Gaiman's Dreaming, which I find extremely exquisite. It's funny when people who have a certain deference for actual magic that are fantasy writers sort of steal from each other, because then what you'll get is an increasingly accurate material.
There is one series that I'd like to bring up. This one breaks away a bit from the previous themes of fantasy that we talked about. In the setting, it breaks away. Now, there is a series called the Shannara Chronicles, and I haven't read the books, but I've watched the show. Mm-hmm. And in the show, it seems that a lot of these magical races, the elves and the gnomes, and this magical organization, the druids, and even demons, mm-hmm. Exist in this world. However, this world seems to take place in the future of the modern world. Mm-hmm. We see throughout that there are cars and helicopters that all look like they've been there for ages, centuries. Essentially, from what I could understand, that there was the modern world as we know it today, and after some event, everything was just wiped out, and out of that, elves and magic and other things came into the world.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because another story that does this a lot is the cartoon series Adventure Time. And it's interesting because you do see a lot of, in the realm of magical scholarship and occult theory, there is a notion that in the times when we as a species were closer to nature, the spirits of nature and other dimensions associated with nature were closer to us as well. So I don't know if it's a question of the apocalypse happened and something in the apocalypse created those things, or if it's modernization shoved those things into a corner, and when people were returned to their more natural ancestral state of being closer to nature, if those things didn't come back or re-encroach, more so than if they were created from some apocalypse. I think it's more likely that at some point in the properly ancient past, like medieval or pre-medieval times, elves, gnomes, etc., had associations with human beings, and as man became more civilized and sectioned himself off, basically, um, those beings were either ignored, driven away, or shunted to the fringes of the world. And then once human civilization crumbled, things kind of returned to their natural state as opposed to some one off created them from scratch.
Yes, because there definitely seems to be things in that world that could not be related to normal human beings, um, like elves and demons, definitely.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's less of a case of an apocalyptic event created them and more an apocalyptic event forced humanity to sort of rediscover things it had forgotten ages before civilization had really gotten going.
I do find it interesting of them doing this in the distant future instead of in the past or an alternate world. I find that interesting.
And oh, it's funny because I could definitely see something akin to this happening because obviously elves and fairies and things of that nature aren't physical beings, that i.e. they're not material. However, in occult circles, the thought is that they are energy beings. They are they are spirits and they have always been spirits. It's not a case of they were once physical and then they are no longer physical. It's more of a case of when a being manifests, it manifests in something approximating physicality, and then it would return to its natural energetic state when it was done interacting with humans. So, in my opinion, something like this probably is going to happen if there's ever an apocalypse because people will rediscover that connection with nature that our ancestors um, had so closely that they took it for granted, and then the Industrial Revolution and things like that happened, and we forgot or we moved into places where those energies couldn't get to us or couldn't interact or manifest to us in the same way they once did.
That's very interesting. Um, I hope to see more fantasy series uh, that touch upon this idea of humanity through some disaster going back to a more natural state and becoming more in touch with magical energies and beings. But let's talk about the Hellboy series from Dark Horse Comics. Hellboy seems to deal a lot with demonology,
Yep.
and of course, the main character, Hellboy, is in fact a half demon. His mother being a witch and his father being what I assume to be a high level demon.
Yeah. I forget his name, but yeah, from at least the lore of Magnolia, he's I believe a prince of hell. Um, interestingly, in the Guillermo del Toro version, because Guillermo del Toro is a massive Lovecraft fanboy, it was sort of retconned that his father was Lovecraftian in nature, which I kind of liked. Um, but I think comics in general, or at least comics that deal with supernatural elements, are respectful in a way that most other mediums are not. And that's one of the reasons I've always loved comics is they treat magic as the intellectual scholarly pursuit that I would like to see more media depicted as, and it's treated like a skill. One of the things that pisses me off is when it's treated like some genetic fluke as opposed to a skill that someone learns or a talent that someone has. Because I'm not opposed to the idea that certain people might be more predisposed to having a talent for magic because there are people who are naturally predisposed to have medical talents or leadership skills or athleticism or any other skill you can think of. So why wouldn't there be people who are naturally sort of gifted at magic? But I resent and defile the notion that the people who don't have that natural affinity can't acquire magical skills. As to Hellboy's accuracy when it comes to demonology and lore and stuff, Magnola does a pretty good job. And in fact, several of the annotated Hellboy editions actually have sections that will itemize the folklore he brings up, which I absolutely love. That not only is that something that other people pay attention to, but it's something that other people paid attention to enough to make an annotated edition. Because usually it's just me who does things like that. But it's nice when it's not just me.
An interesting fact about Hellboy, um, his mother, the witch,
Yeah.
is a descendant of Mordred of Arthurian legend.
Who is himself an offspring of Morgan Le Fay.
Yeah, Morgan Le Fay and King Arthur. And so, because Hellboy is descended from them, it was confirmed in the Hellboy lore that Hellboy is in fact the rightful ruler of England.
Okay. This amuses me.
Yeah,
I,
it was just an amusing bit of
I
fact.
I am trying to imagine Red ruling. I get the feeling that if that were the case, Abe would very much take up the advisory Merlin-esque role, because I don't think I don't think Red would be a very good ruler without advisors and so forth.
Yeah, then you could have Liz be Guinevere, but at least she'd take a
Okay,
much more active
okay.
role.
Now,
Queen.
now I just need a modern recasting of all the prominent figures in Arthurian legend with Hellboy characters. This needs to be a thing.
Well, maybe we could ask Mike McNoll on Twitter to make it.
We probably could get someone in the community to do it because we have a lot of really great artists here. I'm sure Nerd Wonder would like to do it, although I'm not sure if she's familiar with the art style of Hellboy enough to replicate it. Because it would have to be in the art style of Hellboy, otherwise the joke
Yeah,
wouldn't work
that's the
very
only way
well.
it would be appropriate, really.
Or you could do a like um Victorian romance painting style and have it be as though it was a Arthurian rendition.
Mm.
Because there are a lot of medieval paintings of Arthurian legend.
A lot of the higher level beings in Hellboy are oftentimes depicted as Lovecraftian um, kind of monsters.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on these on beings in fiction that are supposed to be so different from humanity or so far beyond our understanding that seeing them just drives you insane?
Well, see, Lovecraft, I think, to something of his discredit, thought that he was innovating when he thought of the notion of things, eldritch things beyond human comprehension or very, very grotesque. Because he was coming from the very narrow sort of post-Victorian, every demon is the red horned thing with the pitchfork, and every angel is a fluffy, winged thing, rendition. Whereas if you look in like medieval demonology and angelology, for example, Lovecraftian is not a descriptor that is very far away from the way a lot of demons and angels were said to um uh manifest themselves. Like I think Lovecraft thought that he was being clever with that when in actuality all he was doing was returning something to the way it's always been, which is these things are vast, eldritch, cosmic level things, and so cramming cramming all of that into a human mind is, like I sort of analogized earlier, kind of like downloading an entire hard drive of a supercomputer onto a single standard flash drive. That is going to warp you significantly, and I think Nietzsche was also unintentionally right when he famously said, "Beware." ye who fight monsters, that you do not become them. If you gaze long into the abyss will gaze long into you. Because there is a notion of that, particularly in high magical work, where you do deal with entities from higher dimensions or lower dimensions, or even side dimensions, of the fact that if you bring an aspect of a different dimension into manifestation in ours, it's going to leave a mark on you. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of magicians are, for lack of a better word, insane. And that's also another reason why I like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, because one of the things that becomes a plot point in that is, in order to see beings um, that aren't human, in order to see fairies and so forth, you have to work up a little madness in oneself, because madness is essentially just the rules of another plane of existence, as opposed to what we think of it as today, which is something that's entirely in your head. Um, and that's another mystically accurate thing I like. Madness can be useful. You just have to remember where your logical intuition stops and where the madness begins.
Well, that's very interesting. Um, it was a really good idea having you on because I don't think another guest could have gone into as much depth with these things as you could.
I apologize. I apologize that I didn't bring more. And it's funny that you say I went into depth, because to me it seems like I just sort of skimmed the surface of material. But then again, I guess it's because this is this is such complex material, and I've spent so long studying it.
To be fair, it'd be difficult for anybody to go into as much depth in these subjects as they would require in the amount of time that we're doing for a podcast.
Yeah, I think I'm going to create a video that's something akin to like a magical curriculum for people that genuinely want to study this stuff, because there's a lot of extremely fatuous or spurious bullshit in particularly the new age community these days. And one of the things I spent a lot of my time doing in the 12 years I've been studying this shit is I've been wading through the stuff that the sort of self-help stuff, the stuff that is spurious and not really particularly useful, and getting into the more complex, concrete, solid occultism.
Well, I'd be certainly interested in watching that. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. We've been going for over an hour now.
Yeah.
It was very great having you on. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah. If you ever want to discuss this or like adjoining like supernatural topics again, just let me know. This is one of the topics I live for, so by all means.
Well, thank you, Dalton. And thank you, everybody who watched this live. And thank you, everybody who listened to this afterwards. You've all been wonderful guests. And thank you for visiting the House of Mr.E. Have a good night.
Cheers, guys.